And as people reveling in the forgiveness of God, we now listen together to his word. It's in Exodus chapter 17. We're going to read the whole chapter. There are Bibles at the end of your pews if you want to follow along there. You'll need them later when Charlie comes to speak to us anyway. But the words will also appear on the screen. Exodus chapter 17, beginning at verse 1. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled, and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, "Choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands." So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side, one on the other, so that his hands remained steady till sunset. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven." Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." He said, "Because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Nick, and good morning, everyone. Well, one of the things that we've been noticing in the book of Exodus is that in this little part that we're in, with Israel on their journey away from Egypt to the Promised Land, we saw it last week and we see it again this week as well, God puts them to the test. Did you hear that? That was in chapter 16, wasn't it? He tested them. And he tests them again today. So I thought I'd test you. Very simple. All you need to do is stand up all on your feet. And if you answer my questions right, you stay standing. If you get them wrong, you have to sit down. I have to trust your honesty here. The prize that you're playing for is celebrations. Wow, so that's exciting. Are you ready? Now, just have to think about the answer. I'll read out the answer, and then if you get it wrong, you must sit down. I have no way of policing you, but I'm going to trust your honesty, okay? Here we go. Number one. In what country were Israel's slaves? Think about it, think about it, think about it, think about it. At the back, Zach? Egypt, correct. Did you all get that right? I hope you did at this stage. Very good. Number two. What was the name of Israel's leader? Lorelei? Moses. Very good. Are we all still standing? Yes, we are. Okay. What was the name of Moses' brother? Ooh, Eliza? Aaron or Aaron. Very good. We're all still standing. Ooh, a few people. Very honest. I appreciate that very much. Thank you. Question 4. What was the 9th plague that struck Egypt? The 9th plague. Anyone? Zach at the back? I like some people are quitting now. Like, I have no idea. I'm going to sit down and give it up. What was it, Zach? Darkness, that's right. 3 days of darkness. A few more people dropping. Okay, here we're going to get tricky now. How much manna did Israel collect the day before the Sabbath? How much manna the day before? What do you think, Eliza? It's a tricky one, isn't it? Anyone? Anyone? Jen. So, double. I will accept double. 2 omers is what it says. I'll accept double. Question number 6. What instrument did Miriam take in her hand when she sang a song about Egypt's defeat? Anyone? Anyone? Some people still standing? Oh, yeah, very good. We've got rid of David Mayland. This is awful. What do you think? A tambourine. Yes, very good. Okay. Is it just Martin Horder left? This is a real test. Oh, and Zach thinks he might be in. Are you being honest, Zach? I'll leave it with you. Question 7. How many of his best chariots did Pharaoh take with him when he pursued Israel? His best chariots. Martin Horder's out. Zach, we're going to have to ask you, what is it? 2? 600. Okay. I've got one more question. Everyone, you don't have to stand up. But if you get this right, you'll win it. So this is for all of you now. You're back in. What was the name of Aaron's wife's brother? Come on, guys. What's that? Greg. It's not Greg. Close. It's not her. That's a good guess, though. The answer was Nahshon. So none of you win my prize. You're all hopeless. But do you know what? There wasn't anything even in there. Now, why on earth have we done all that? Partly so that we know that some of us have been listening very well. That's very good to see. But much more, when you think about testing, that's the sort of thing we think about, isn't it? Or maybe actually today we think about lateral flow testing and that nervousness we feel waiting to see if there's going to be a second line appearing. When you had tests at school, you might remember it. Grown-ups, it might be bringing back awful memories, the sweaty palms, the anxiety. What's the question my teacher's going to set me? Am I going to get it right? It can be easy when we come to hear that God tests Israel, that's the sort of thing he's doing, giving them a sort of prize that they might be able to win, but then making it really, really tricky for them. God might sound like a sort of cruel quizmaster, even a sort of distant school teacher patrolling up and down the rows as you look in horror at the exam paper, you can't answer the questions. But remember we saw last week, we began to see that that's not the picture of God that we get in the book of Exodus. He's not a God who's out to kind of trip us up and trick us. This whole idea of testing in the book of Exodus is really about God working in Israel's life so that they don't trust in themselves and their own resources anymore, but they rely on him. And that's the very, very, very best thing that any of us can do. As we go through life, learning through all the things that come our way, not to rely on our own resources, but like last week, Israel, morning by morning, day by day, looking to God to provide. That's what it means in Exodus for God to test Israel. It's like he is training them, and he does send things into their lives that are difficult. But the point of it is not to catch them out, to make them sweat and get anxious. It's to teach them to trust him and not themselves. And in today's stories, we see more about the character of God that helps them to do just that. So, children, it's time for you to go over to St. Monica's. Grown-ups, why don't you take a moment just to say hello to people around you. We'll just take a 2-minute break, and then we'll come back together and carry on with what we're looking at. So, 2 minutes to say hello to your neighbour, and then we'll carry on. Hello, neighbour. Okay, I gave you about a minute there, so sorry about that. But let's come back together. The 2 episodes that we're going to be looking at, that Nick read for us, the children are looking at next door. Water from the rock, when Moses comes and strikes this rock with the staff of God and water gushes out. And then this battle where the Amalekites come and attack Israel, and Moses stands on that hill with the staff of God raised, and while he has his hands raised, Israel win. As soon as they lower, Israel loses. They're, in one sense, familiar stories. They're kind of little, slightly strange moments, but we sort of might have heard of the sort of vague outlines. One of the most important things as we are sort of working through Exodus is to think about how these two episodes fit into everything else that's going on in the story. And it's really important, I think, that these episodes follow on from chapter 16, which, if you remember last week, chapter 16 is really about their whole journey, Israel's whole journey through the wilderness. Although this is one of the few places where the manna and quail thing is mentioned, it's clear that, as we saw last week, this was going to be their pattern of life, day by day, moment by moment. Manna on the ground in the morning, quails in the evening. They were going to be learning throughout their whole wilderness journey, 40 years, of God giving them what they needed day after day. And so when we come to chapter 17, if you like, the stage is set for that long, long, long journey, that long, long, long lesson in trusting God to provide. But then as we turn the page, if you like, on chapter 17, it looks like almost sort of straight away they run into a sort of car crash level difficulty. Although they've been set up with this thing of God providing food for them morning and evening, and it's going to be that way for the whole of their journey, chapter 17 comes along and there's no water. So all very well having food day by day, but if you've got no water, you've got 3 days, haven't you? Something like that, before you're done for. And you can understand in that sense why Israel raised the question. Hang on a minute. God has made a big show, a big play of we're trusting you day after day, God, for the food, and straight away he takes our water away. Is this a God you can trust for that whole long journey? If, the moment you set out on it, he seems to kind of fail you on an even more basic need. And really, I think the point of these two episodes in Israel's life, and therefore for us too as we listen in, is to show the kind of character of God, which means that even when these seemingly abrupt turns are taken, where God in a moment seems to withdraw, having promised to sort of trust him and commanded to trust day by day, then even in those moments, this is a God you can trust. This is a God that you can walk with, because he will walk with you and has a level of intimate, personal concern for you. That's what's going on here. And we see it sort of unfolded in these two episodes, which show two different aspects of that personal commitment of God to Israel. The first episode, the water from the rock thing, is about God's personal commitment to providing for us. Now, the thing that's really striking about that episode, is it's all set up as basically a lawsuit. So it's not just that Israel are questioning God and sort of doubting him. It's that they have come to the point of making a kind of accusation against him. The language that's used, in fact, the whole setup of the scene is like a courtroom is being set up. They start off, did you notice, complaining about Moses, going after Moses. Verse 2, they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses tries to sort of, call them off, but they were thirsty for water, it says in verse 3, and they grumbled against Moses. Their target is Moses, but what Moses does, it says, really, your problem is with God. And so Moses sets up the two parties. It's not that the people really have a problem with Moses, that they're questioning, they're doubting, they're accusing God. And the scene that follows, what God does in response to that in verse 5, when he says to Moses, "Go out in front of the people, take with you some of the elders, and take in your hand the staff," he puts in place all the props, all the facilities, if you like, for there to be a judgment brought. He calls the witnesses some of the elders of Israel. He sort of, if you like, brings his own presence in. The staff is his power to judge. If you've sort of been following that thread as we've looked at the plagues in particular, Moses has this staff in his hand, and that is the kind of agent, if you like, of God's power to judge. He's just struck down Egypt with this thing. And he's bringing it out again. And he's going out in front of the people. What would you think if you were Israel? You've just had a proper go at God. You failed us. You should have left us in Egypt. Out comes the staff. Out come the witnesses. They must have been quaking in their boots. Oh dear. We've taken that. We know what that staff can do. We've just had a go at God. What's he going to do to us? That's the drama of the scene here. From a sort of bird's eye perspective, we can see Israel have got it so wrong. This is a God they can trust, but for them, surely they're in trouble. And that's why verse 6 is such a, in the reading of the story, if you like, such a shock. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb, strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. By the rock at Horeb, God really is saying, I'm going to come and stand on that rock, and you strike the rock, and I'm associated with the rock. It's a shocking moment. Really what should happen is Moses should carry that staff and strike the people. But God says, I'm going to come and you're going to strike me instead. Now it's shocking, but it's also, I think, supposed to be, for them, sort of mysterious. When the water gushes out, I think they were supposed to look around and think, well, who got struck there? Who got judged? We had a courtroom. It was all set up. Where's the guilty party here? There's a sense in which it doesn't make sense. But at the very least, Israel is supposed to see this God, our God, is so personally committed to providing for us that he will come down and be struck by the staff of God, and we'll get the water. But we won't get the punishment. Now, of course, you might be seeing where this is going. In fact, the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, if you like, puts the pieces of the puzzle together. Things that were, at best, sort of in outline, sketch form, almost sort of murkily maybe seen. Here's a God who commits himself to us so personally that he'll be struck so we get the water. Well, Ollie, if you can just put up the next few slides. These are some words from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 to 4. Paul says this, "For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ." Paul puts the pieces of the puzzle together and shows you, if you like, what was going on here. God was so personally committed to providing for his people that Christ himself was struck so that his people could have water. This is, if you like, this moment is a foretelling, a foreshadowing of the extraordinary provision God will make eventually in space and time history in the life and death of Jesus Christ. Now, Israel weren't going to get all of that, but at the very least, the whole setup of the scene is telling them, here is a God who you can trust, a God who will step down and be struck for you so that you will get water. Though the pieces of that puzzle don't come together until we see God doing that in the most profound way in Jesus Christ, where Jesus is struck, experiencing as a human being the power of God's judgment in our place, so that out of him come streams of living water for us. So is God a sort of mean schoolmaster who puts things in our path to trip us up and, sits back and watches us fail? The Water from the Rock episode says that's not his character at all. And we can know that even more so from the vantage point of the cross. But here's what's striking about Paul's application of this idea. The next few slides, if you could, Ollie. This is what Paul, how Paul explains or applies this very point. It's quite challenging. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now, these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil as they did. Because there is an undertone in this episode of real spiritual malice in the way that Israel not just questioned God, but if you like, set up this lawsuit. It's the seeds of a really, really sort of dark part of their story. That despite all the ways that God provides for them, rescuing them from Egypt, providing for them day by day on their way to the promised land, this generation, the generation who this happens to, with the exception of one or two individuals like Joshua, who we're going to come on to in a second, they don't make it to the promised land because they have not set their hearts on God, but on, as Paul says, evil things. It's a theme that we've explored a few times. Things apart from God that they make more important than God. In the end, take their hearts away from him. And it seems to me like the antidote to that is to see God as this generous providing God that he really is. They didn't learn the lesson, in other words. They didn't learn the lesson from the Water from the Rock episode. And so they went on with this seed of distrust, just sitting in their hearts, that in time came to flower again to full-on rebellion against God and kicking him away. And perhaps that helps us to think through what, if you like, this episode means for us. If Israel didn't learn, will we learn? Will we, with the puzzle pieces put together for us so the picture is even more complete? This period coming up from Lent, from Ash Wednesday through to Easter, is a time when the church traditionally adopts a sort of posture of lament, of mourning, of penitence. A time of self-examination where we consider the depths of the problem of the human heart. And of course, we look out across our world at the moment, and that darkness is writ large in some of the events we're seeing on our own continent. I suppose what I'm saying is making an invitation to all of us to use this time of Lent to consider the darkness of humanity, but also to consider where that touches, where that comes home into our lives, so that we are, if you like, ready to see the depth of the provision that God makes for us in the cross of Jesus, which we celebrate and commemorate and remember and give thanks for at Easter. And then through that, to see that we have a God who is this personally committed, that he would come in the person of Jesus Christ for us. That's his personal commitment to providing for us. And that's what the first half of the chapter is teaching. The second half of the chapter, if you like, sort of moves on a little bit, not so much talking about God's provision, but his protection. So Moses on the mountain, raising his hands, and as he does that, Israel wins. When he lowers them, Israel loses. Now, what does that mean? There's all kinds of ways that people have understood this. It feels like there's something about prayer going on here. As Moses raises his hands, seemingly in prayer, Israel win. Raising your hands is a a common expression in the Bible for praying to God. So there's definitely lessons to draw here about prayer. But really, I think the point of this story is again about God's personal commitment to his people. He's so committed that he himself is going to act to defeat their enemies. That helps us, I think, to make some sense of the strength of the kind of condemnation of Amalek. I don't know if you heard it. Towards the end of the reading, the book of Exodus has very, very, very harsh words to say about these other nations. It's a theme we see throughout these early books of the Bible. Verse 14 of chapter 17, the Lord said to Moses, "Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven." Verse 16, because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. It's a theme I think increasingly we will find very difficult in the sort of age that we live. This kind of idea of a complete destruction of these people like the Amalekites. And we're not going to be able to solve that question here. But at least in this episode, I think that idea of completely destroying the Amalekites is meant to sort of sit under or go alongside the fact that God is so committed to protecting his people Israel that he will completely destroy those enemies of Israel that come up against them. In chapter 17, the Amalekites come and attack Israel. In that sense, Israel haven't gone against them. And God wants his people to know that he is so concerned for them that he will destroy their enemies completely. Again, it's a theme that we sort of saw in chapter 14 at the Red Sea. And so what we see happening with Moses raising his arms and the battle being won is not so much the fact that he's praying to God. It's all about the staff again. In verse 9, he says, "Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands." This staff that represents God's power, remember, to judge. When the staff is raised, when God is fighting for Israel, that's when they win. When the staff is lowered, they lose. You need God fighting for you. You need God standing there, if you like, to defeat your enemies. The point of this episode is that God is so committed to his people that he will do that. Now again, taking it forward, if you like, for us today, after the events of the Gospels, after the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, how do we apply that for us? Well, I think it does have things to teach us about prayer. But much more than that, it teaches us about someone who, if you like, is praying for us right now. Here's another verse, if you could, Ollie, from Romans chapter 8. Christ Jesus, who died, more than that, who was raised to life, is at the right hand of God and is also interceding for us. How is it that we today can know the protection of God over us, whatever the enemies we face? It's because we have someone who is like Moses, but a lot better, who will never, ever, ever tire, interceding for us. It's a theme in the New Testament that, when you sort of dig into it, is just unbelievably good news. That Jesus is standing before God, if you like, pleading his blood shed for us, so that God will never, ever, ever send us away from his presence, bring that staff of judgment down upon us. If Jesus is interceding for us, appealing to God on the basis of his work, dying in our place, then whatever we face, Whatever the darkness of the valley we're going through, we can be sure God has not, and he will never toss us aside, give up on us, send us away from his presence. One old writer put it like this: if I could hear Christ praying for me in the next room, I would not fear a million enemies. Yet distance makes no difference. He is praying for me. One modern writer put it like this: it is as if Jesus is hitting refresh on our justification. You know, when you go to a website and you think, I think the website is old. It's been updated, so hit refresh and see what's happened. Oh, look, all that old stuff is taken away. It's as if Jesus before God is hitting refresh. He's saying, what happened 2,000 years ago is still live. It's still there. It still counts for us. And again, that's why when Paul applies this, well, it's extraordinary. We have these next few verses from Romans chapter 8. You probably know them well. As I've been thinking about this, it's extraordinary that these follow on from that idea of Christ interceding for us. Paul says, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As it is written, for your sake we face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord." Because we have one who does not tire, standing before God, interceding for us, we can know God's protection in the present day. Now, of course, that doesn't answer so many of the questions we have about when those moments of deep darkness come. You might well have seen videos this week of brothers and sisters singing hymns to God in the subways of of Kiev. I don't know how I would speak to brothers and sisters about this if I was with them. That feels like, coming home as close as you can imagine, the darkest, hardest valley to walk through. But it is no less true for those brothers and sisters that Christ is interceding for them. And so if you like, as we join our prayers for them as well, we can be sure that whatever the darkest night brothers and sisters face in Ukraine, God's provision and protection is true and real for them, just as it's true for us now. So that as we are led by God through this pilgrimage in the wilderness, this journey through the desert that we are on, his testing is not the schoolmaster. It's not the cruel taskmaster. He is working to get us to trust him and walk with him. And all along the way, his provision and his protection, they surround us. This is what the chapter's teaching for Israel. It's even more true, or even more clear for us today. If I could hear Christ praying for me in the next room, I would not fear a million enemies. Yet distance makes no difference. He is praying for me. Let's take a few moments to be quiet, and then I'm going to lead us in some prayers of intercession for ourselves and for our world in particular.